The dust cloud appeared first, moving slow and deliberate across the flatlands. Silas Brennan straightened from the fence post he'd been repairing, his hammer hanging loose in his calloused hand. Visitors were rare out here, where the nearest neighbor lived half a day's ride away. The figure emerged from the heat shimmer like something pulled from a dream he couldn't quite remember. Tall, impossibly tall, and moving with purpose toward his porch. When she finally stopped at the bottom of his steps, Silas found himself looking up at a woman who seemed to tower over everything around her. She held a leather satchel against her chest, and her eyes carried a weight that made his stomach tighten with an unease he couldn't name. Silas wiped his palms against his work pants, buying himself a moment to process what he was seeing. The woman wore traditional Apache clothing, the fringed leather moving slightly in the dry wind. Her shoulders were broad, her posture unnervingly straight, and she studied him with an intensity that felt like being measured for something he didn't understand. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 3 years since his father passed, and in that time, he'd grown comfortable with silence and routine. This felt like neither. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she climbed the 3 wooden steps to his porch, and each footfall seemed to echo louder than it should. When she reached the top, the physical reality of her height became impossible to ignore. Silas was not a short man by any measure, but standing face to face with her meant tilting his head back to meet her gaze. Something ancient and deliberate lived in those eyes, something that made him feel like a child caught in a lie he hadn't yet told. The leather satchel opened with a soft creak, and she withdrew a stack of papers bound with frayed twine. The documents looked old, the edges yellowed and brittle. She held them out toward him without a word, and Silas found his hands reaching for them before his mind caught up to his body. "You're Brennan." Her voice was steady, not a question but a statement of fact that somehow felt like an accusation. "I am." His throat felt dry. "Silas Brennan. Your father was William Brennan." The way she said his father's name sent a chill through his chest that had nothing to do with the wind picking up across the valley. There was history in those words, weight and pain and something sharp underneath. Silas looked down at the papers in his hands. The top document showed a map, hand-drawn in faded ink, with boundary markers and notations in handwriting he recognized immediately. His father's handwriting. What is this? The truth. She shifted her weight, and for the first time, Silas caught something in her expression that looked almost like exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. The truth about what your father did, about what he took. Silas's jaw tightened. His father had been many things, but dishonest wasn't one of them. William Brennan had built this ranch from nothing, working land that no one else wanted until he turned it into something worth having. The old man had died with honor, respected by everyone who knew him. Whatever this woman thought she knew, she had it wrong. My father was a good man. Your father was a thief. She said it without malice, just stating a fact as simple as the color of the sky. And I can prove it. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the porch between them. Silas looked at the papers in his hands, then back up at the woman who seemed to block out the sun. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory flickered. A conversation overheard as a boy, his father speaking in hushed tones to another man about complications and necessary actions and keeping the past buried. "Who are you?" "My name is Ayasha." She reached into the satchel again, pulling out another document, this one sealed with wax that had cracked with age. "And I'm here to take back what belongs to my people." Silas stared at the wax seal on the document, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to entertain. The afternoon sun beat down on the porch and sweat gathered at the back of his neck despite the breeze. Ayasha stood motionless, waiting with the kind of patience that suggested she had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. "Take back what exactly?" His voice came out harder than he intended, defensive. She gestured toward the open land stretching beyond his fence line, where brown grass swayed in waves across the valley floor. All of this, from the creek bed to the eastern ridge. 300 acres that were promised to my grandfather's people as permanent settlement. Silas felt heat rise in his chest. "My father bought this land fair and square. I've seen the deed. It's legal. Legal and fair are not the same thing." Ayasha unfolded the sealed document carefully, revealing dense handwriting and signatures at the bottom. "This is the original agreement, signed by territorial representatives and witnessed by a federal agent. It guaranteed safe passage and settlement rights to Apache families relocating from disputed territories. Your father was one of 3 men who signed as local guarantors. The name leaped out at him from the bottom of the page. William Brennan, in the same confident script that Silas had seen on letters and ledgers throughout his childhood. The date showed more than 20 years past, when Silas had been barely old enough to remember much beyond the ranch house and his mother's cooking. Guarantors of what? Protection, resources, the right to build without harassment. Ayesha's jaw tightened. For 6 months my people lived here, built shelters, planted crops, started to believe they'd finally found somewhere the government would leave them alone. Silas wanted to argue, to defend the man who'd raised him with stories of hard work and honest dealing. But something in Ayesha's tone carried the weight of truth. She wasn't performing or exaggerating. She was stating facts with the resignation of someone who'd had to repeat them too many times. What happened? Water. She pointed to a section of the map where someone had drawn a jagged line in different ink. Your father and his partners discovered a natural spring system running underground through this entire valley. More water than anyone expected to find out here. Enough to make the land valuable. The pieces started connecting in Silas's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. He knew about the springs. They were the reason this ranch could support cattle when neighboring properties struggled through dry seasons. His father had always called it luck, divine providence, the reward for taking a chance on land nobody else wanted. So they asked us to leave. Ayesha's voice dropped lower. When we refused to abandon what we'd been promised, they brought men with weapons, burned the shelters, destroyed the crops. My grandfather tried to show them the agreement. This document you're holding now. They took it from him and told him to disappear or die. Silas looked down at the paper in his hands, at his father's signature bold and clear at the bottom. The sun felt too hot suddenly, the air too thick. Somewhere in the distance, one of his horses whinnied from the corral, a normal sound in a moment that felt increasingly unreal. Why now? Why come here after all this time? Ayesha met his eyes. And for the first time, he saw something other than determination there. He saw grief, old and deep, the kind that never fully heals. Because my grandfather died last month, and before he passed, he made me promise to finish what he started, to prove the truth, to make sure at least one Brennan knows what really happened on this land. The wind shifted, carrying dust across the porch between them. Silas realized his hands were shaking slightly, making the old papers tremble. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about this place, about the foundation of his entire life, suddenly felt like it was built on sand instead of stone. There's more. Ayesha pulled another item from her satchel, something wrapped in cloth. Something buried on your property that proves everything I'm saying, and I need your permission to find it. Silas felt the question rise in his throat before he could stop it. What's buried? Evidence. Ayesha unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a piece of carved stone no bigger than her palm. Symbols marked its surface, weathered but still visible. This is half of a boundary marker. Apache families use them to mark territory boundaries in agreements with settlers. They were always made in pairs, buried at opposite ends of claimed land. This one came from the western edge near the creek. She turned it over in her hands, and Silas saw how the bottom edge was jagged, clearly broken from a larger piece. The craftsmanship was detailed despite the stone's age, showing patterns that meant nothing to him but clearly held significance for her. The other half should be buried near the eastern ridge, where your property line runs now. If we find it, and the pieces match, it proves this land was marked as Apache territory before any deed your father claimed. Silas looked past her toward the eastern section of his ranch, where rocky outcrops gave way to steeper terrain. He'd ridden that ridge hundreds of times, checking fence lines and searching for stray cattle. Never once had he thought about what might lie beneath the surface. This doesn't make sense. He heard the desperation creeping into his own voice. My father built this ranch from nothing. He worked himself nearly to death making something out of empty land. You're telling me it was all stolen? I'm telling you what happened. Ayesha's expression remained neutral, neither angry nor sympathetic. What you choose to believe is your decision. But the truth doesn't change based on what's convenient. The words hit harder than any accusation. Silas wanted to order her off his property, to refuse everything she was saying, and go back to the simple certainty he'd woken up with that morning. Instead, he found himself remembering small things. His father's refusal to discuss certain topics, The way conversation would stop when Silas entered a room as a boy. An old wooden box his father kept locked in the cellar. Contents unknown. Even if you're right. Even if there is another marker buried out there. What does it matter now? The land is legally mine. The past is done. Ayasha's jaw tightened. The past is only done for people who didn't lose everything. For my people, for my family, the past is every day. It's in every promise broken, every piece of land taken, every agreement ignored. Your father's signature on that document means something. It means he gave his word, and then shattered it, when keeping it became inconvenient. Silas felt anger rising, hot and defensive, but underneath it, something else stirred. Doubt. The uncomfortable recognition that he'd never actually asked hard questions about how his father acquired this land. He'd simply accepted the story told to him, believed what was easiest to believe. You rode all the way out here just to tell me my father was a liar? I rode out here because you deserve to know the truth. Ayasha placed the stone marker on the porch railing between them. And because I'm giving you a choice your father never gave my grandfather. You can help me find that second marker, or you can pretend this conversation never happened. Either way, I'm not leaving until I've searched every inch of that eastern ridge. The sun had started its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. Silas looked at the stone marker, at the document still clutched in his hands, at the woman who stood taller than any person he'd ever met and carried herself with quiet certainty that felt unshakable. If I let you search and you find nothing, you leave. No more accusations, no more claims. And if we find it? Silas swallowed hard, knowing he was about to step across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then I'll listen to whatever else you have to say. Ayasha nodded once, picking up the stone marker. We should start now. We're losing daylight, and that ridge is rough terrain in the dark. They rode in silence toward the eastern ridge, Silas on his bay mare and Ayasha, walking alongside with long, steady strides that matched the horse's pace. The stone marker rested in a pouch tied to her belt, and she kept one hand near it as they moved through the valley. Silas found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the physical presence of this woman with the story she'd brought to his doorstep. The ridge rose gradually from the valley floor, rocky soil giving way to harder terrain dotted with juniper and scattered brush. As they climbed higher, Silas noticed Ayasha scanning the ground with focused intensity, reading the landscape the way he'd read ledgers or brand marks on cattle. There, she pointed to a flat section of ground where the soil showed a different color than surrounding areas. That's where we dig. Silas dismounted, pulling a shovel from where he'd strapped it to his saddle. The ground was harder than he expected, packed down by years of weather and time. He worked the blade into the earth, feeling resistance with each thrust. Ayasha knelt nearby, brushing away loose dirt with her hands and examining what lay beneath. After 20 minutes of digging, the shovel struck something solid with a dull thunk that sent vibrations up Silas's arms. He cleared away more dirt carefully, revealing a flat stone surface marked with the same symbols he'd seen on the piece Ayasha carried. She reached down and worked the stone free, turning it over to reveal the jagged edge that matched perfectly with the broken marker from her pouch. The two pieces fit together seamlessly, creating a complete boundary marker that showed detailed carvings on both sides. Silas stood back, breathing hard from the exertion, and watched Ayasha hold the reunited pieces in her palms. Her expression remained controlled, but he saw her shoulders tighten and her breathing deepen. We marked both ends of the settlement, east and west, to show the boundaries promised in the agreement. Her voice carried traces of something raw underneath the steady tone. My grandfather helped carve these. He told me about placing them in the ground, about believing they would stand as proof of the promises made. Silas wiped sweat from his forehead, his mind working through implications he still wanted to reject. Could be coincidence. Could be these were here before any agreement, part of something older. Look around you. Ayasha gestured toward the ground they'd been clearing. What do you see? He looked closer at the area surrounding the marker. Now that the surface dirt had been disturbed, he could make out patterns in the soil. Dark patches and rectangular shapes, the ghost outlines of structures long gone. Scattered among them, small fragments of pottery and woven material so deteriorated they crumbled at the lightest touch. Shelter foundations. Ayasha moved to one of the rectangular outlines, kneeling to trace its edges with her fingers. Adobe and wood frames, 12 of them, arranged in a semicircle facing east. Standard Apache temporary settlement pattern. My grandfather described this exact layout. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just story or accusation anymore. This was physical evidence. Tangible proof that people had lived here, built here, invested hope and labor into ground they believed was theirs by legal right. He walked to another outline, then another, counting them out. 12 structures, just as Ayasha had said. Each one roughly the same size, positioned with clear intention and planning. Between them, he found more fragments. A rusted piece of metal that might have been a cooking implement. Smooth stones arranged in a circular pattern that suggested a fire pit. How long were they here? 6 months. Long enough to plant crops that started to grow. Long enough for children to feel safe playing in the open. Long enough to forget about always looking over their shoulders. Ayasha stood, brushing dirt from her hands. And then your father and his partners came with men carrying rifles and torches. The sun touched the horizon, painting the valley in shades of orange and deep red. Silas looked down at the boundary marker pieces still held together in Ayasha's hands, then back at the ghost settlement spread across the ridge. Everything his father had told him about this land, about how it came to be theirs, suddenly felt like a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect a son from ugly truths. There's more, isn't there? He heard defeat creeping into his own voice. More you haven't told me yet. Ayasha nodded slowly. There's a name I need you to remember. Ruth Neshoba. She was my grandmother, and your father knew her very well. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Ruth Neshoba. Silas repeated it silently, searching his memory for any mention, any story from his childhood that might connect to it. Nothing surfaced, except the growing certainty that his father had kept more secrets than he'd ever imagined. They rode back to the ranch as darkness settled over the valley. Ayasha accepted his offer to sleep in the spare room, though she made it clear she expected nothing and would have been content sleeping outside under the stars. Silas lay awake in his own bed for hours, staring at the ceiling beams his father had installed with his own hands, wondering what other lies those beams had witnessed. Morning came with pale light filtering through dusty windows. Silas found Ayasha already awake, sitting on the porch with the boundary marker pieces laid out before her. He brought coffee without asking if she wanted any, and she accepted it with a small nod that might have been gratitude. I need to check something. Silas set his cup down, a thought from the night finally crystallizing into action. There's a cellar beneath the barn. My father kept a chest down there. Locked it. Told me it was just old business papers. Nothing important. But he never let me see inside. Ayasha's eyes followed him as he crossed the yard toward the barn. He felt her presence behind him as he pulled open the heavy doors and descended into the cool darkness below. The cellar smelled of earth and old wood. Silas lit a lantern, casting wavering shadows across stacked crates and tools hanging from wall hooks. The chest sat in the far corner, exactly where it had been for as long as Silas could remember. Heavy wood bound with iron straps, secured with a padlock that had rusted but still held firm. He'd always assumed the lock was there to protect important documents from moisture or rodents. Now he wondered what his father had really been protecting. It took him 3 strikes with a hammer to break the lock free. The metal gave way with a sharp crack, and the chest lid creaked open on stiff hinges. Inside, stacks of papers lay organized in bundles, each tied with string that had turned brittle with age. Silas pulled out the first bundle and untied it carefully. Contracts. Multiple versions of the same land deed, each showing different signatures and dates. Some listed Apache witnesses who'd supposedly agreed to relocate. Others showed purchase agreements that documented sales that, if Ayasha's story was true, had never actually occurred. His father's handwriting appeared throughout, along with names Silas recognized as other prominent ranch owners in the territory. Beneath the contracts, he found a leather-bound journal. His hands trembled as he opened it, recognizing his father's tight, controlled script filling page after page. The entries began almost 20 years earlier, documenting negotiations with territorial officials about land distribution and settlement agreements. Silas read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Met with Ruth Neshoba today. She speaks English better than most whites I know. Smart woman. Too smart to trust easily. Had to work to convince her the agreement was legitimate. She wanted assurances for her people. Gave them. Knew even then we couldn't honor them if we found what we were looking for. Ayasha stood perfectly still, her face unreadable in the lantern light. Silas continued reading, each entry worse than the last. His father had documented everything. The discovery of the underground springs, The decision to force the Apache families out. The deliberate destruction of their settlement. The falsification of documents to make the land seizure appear legal. One entry made Silas's stomach turn. Ruth came to the house today, desperate, said her people had nowhere to go, that we'd given our word. She was right. We had. But a man's word means nothing measured against what this land is worth. Told her to leave by sunset or face consequences. She looked at me with such disappointment, almost made me reconsider. Almost. Silas closed the journal, unable to read further. He looked up at Ayesha, seeing her standing with arms crossed, face turned slightly away. Not hiding tears, but something deeper. Vindication mixed with old pain. The bitter satisfaction of being proven right about something terrible. Ruth Neshoba was your grandmother. She was. Ayesha's voice remained steady, and she never stopped telling the story of what happened here. She lived another 15 years after your father forced us out. 15 years of watching her people scattered, struggling on land that couldn't support them. She died never seeing justice. But she made my grandfather promise to keep the documents, to preserve the evidence, and he made me promise to bring it back here, to show at least one Brennan the truth. Silas looked down at his father's journal, at the careful documentation of theft and betrayal written in familiar handwriting. The foundation of everything he'd believed about his family had crumbled completely. He wasn't just inheriting land, he was inheriting guilt. Silas sat on the cellar steps with his father's journal in his lap, feeling the weight of it like an anchor pulling him underwater. Ayesha remained standing near the chest, giving him space to process what he'd discovered. The lantern flame flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move with accusation. "What do you want from me?" His voice came out rough, stripped of the defensiveness that had carried him through the previous day. This was genuine question now, not challenge. "I want you to acknowledge what happened here." Ayesha moved closer, her footsteps deliberate on the packed earth floor. "I want the truth documented somewhere other than in my family's memory. I want proof that my grandmother wasn't lying, that my grandfather didn't spend his life chasing ghosts." Silas looked up at her, seeing past the intimidating height to the person underneath. She wasn't here for revenge or to destroy him. She was here for something simpler and somehow more difficult. Recognition, validation that her family's suffering had been real and unjust. "The land." He forced himself to say it. "You want me to give back the land. I want you to make it right." She knelt down, bringing herself closer to his eye level, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression softened slightly. "However that looks, I'm not here to take your home or leave you with nothing. But this ranch was built on theft. Your father knew it. Now you know it. What you do with that knowledge defines who you are." The words hit harder than any accusation she'd made. Silas thought about his mother, dead 5 years now, who'd never known the truth about how her husband acquired their prosperity. He thought about the work he'd put into maintaining this ranch, the sweat and calluses earned honestly, even if the foundation beneath them wasn't. "If I acknowledge this publicly, I lose everything. The community won't forgive me for shaming my father's memory. Other ranchers will call me weak. Some will try to take advantage, claim I'm giving up legal rights to land. I'll be finished here. Yes." Ayesha didn't sugarcoat it or offer false comfort. "You probably will be. That's the cost of doing what's right when wrong has been profitable." Silas stood, pacing the small cellar space, his mind racing through options that all seemed to end in loss. He could burn the journal, destroy the evidence, send Ayesha away and pretend she'd never come. Keep the ranch, keep his reputation, keep the comfortable lie he'd lived inside for 3 decades. But he'd seen the settlement ruins on the ridge. He'd held the boundary markers that proved promises made and broken. He'd read his father's own words documenting calculated cruelty. The evidence existed in his hands and in his memory now. Ignoring it wouldn't make it untrue. There's legal precedent for land disputes. He was thinking aloud now, working through possibilities. If your family can prove prior claim with documented agreements, even old ones, there are territorial courts that might hear the case. It would take years. Cost money neither of us probably has. But it's a path. I don't want a court battle. Ayesha stood as well, and in the confined space of the cellar, her height seemed even more pronounced. "I want you to choose. Freely, without being forced by judges or lawyers. I want one Brennan to look at what was done and decide to make it right because it's the correct thing to do. Not because someone made them." The challenge in her words was clear. She was offering him something his father never had. A choice made in full knowledge of consequences. Redemption earned through sacrifice instead of convenience. Silas climbed the cellar steps, emerging into morning light that felt too bright after the dim lantern glow. Ayesha followed, and they stood together in the barn doorway looking out at land that suddenly felt less like home and more like crime scene. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to figure out how to do this without destroying myself completely in the process. Time to understand what making this right actually means in practical terms." "How much time?" "A few days. Maybe a week." Silas turned to face her directly. "I'm not refusing. I'm not running from this. But if I'm going to dismantle everything my father built, I need to do it in a way that means something. That actually helps your people instead of just being symbolic." Ayesha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "1 week. I'll stay nearby. There's abandoned line shack land about 2 miles north. I can camp there. But Silas, if you use this time to hide evidence or prepare defenses, I'll know. And I won't be this patient twice." 3 days passed in tense quiet. Silas spent the time reading through every document in his father's chest, making lists of affected parties and potential solutions. He barely slept, his mind working through scenarios that all seemed to end in some form of ruin. On the 4th morning, riders appeared on the horizon. 4 men approached the ranch house, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air. Silas recognized them immediately. Porter Hastings owned the neighboring spread to the south. The 2 brothers, Marcus and Cole Sutton, ran cattle on the land west of the valley. And bringing up the rear, Martin Webb, who served as unofficial spokesman for the Territorial Ranchers Association. They dismounted without invitation, faces set in expressions that promised confrontation. Silas stepped onto his porch, forcing his posture to remain relaxed, despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Heard you've got an Apache woman staying on your property." Porter spoke first, his tone carrying the weight of accusation. "Heard she's been making claims about land rights and old agreements." "Word travels fast." Silas kept his voice neutral. "She's been here. She left. Left to that old line shack north of here." Marcus Sutton spat into the dirt. "We saw her, tall as a damn tree and twice as unsettling. What's she want?" Silas felt the moment crystallizing around him, choices narrowing down to a single path. He could lie, dismiss Ayesha's claims as the ravings of someone chasing old grievances. These men would believe him. They'd help run her off if he asked. Life would return to normal. But he'd spent 3 days reading his father's journal. He'd seen the evidence of deliberate theft documented in careful handwriting. He'd stood on ground that still held the ghost outlines of homes burned to ash. Normal suddenly felt like another word for complicit. She wants recognition that her people were forced off land they had legal claim to. She has documentation proving it. The silence that followed carried weight. Cole Sutton's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle on his saddle. Martin Webb's jaw clenched, and Porter Hastings took a step closer to the porch, his expression shifting from suspicious to dangerous. "You're not seriously considering her claims." Webb's voice dropped low. "Your father was a respected man, built this valley alongside the rest of us. You start letting Indians question land rights, you undermine every property deed in the territory. My father was a thief." The words came out harder than Silas intended, but once started he couldn't stop. He signed agreements promising safe settlement, then broke those promises when it became profitable. I have his journal. I have his confession written in his own hand. He knew exactly what he was doing. Porter's face flushed red. "You watch your mouth about William Brennan. That man helped establish order in this territory when it was nothing but dust and danger. He made hard choices so people like you could live safe and prosperous. He made cruel choices." Silas felt something hardening inside him, a resolve that surprised him with its certainty. "And I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it's convenient." Marcus Sutton pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard, not pointing it directly at Silas but making its presence clear. "You're talking about undoing established property law, about questioning the legitimacy of every ranch in this valley. That kind of talk is dangerous. Threatening me with weapons is dangerous." Silas didn't move from his position on the porch, but his right hand drifted closer to where his own rifle leaned against the doorframe. "I'm not trying to undo anyone else's claims. This is about my land and my father's actions. What I do with that information is my business. It becomes all our business when you start validating Apache claims." Webb moved his horse forward slightly. "You set a precedent here, And suddenly every tribe from here to the Eastern Territories will start digging up old agreements and demanding restitution. You'll destabilize everything we've built." Silas saw the fear underneath their anger now. These men weren't just protecting property. They were protecting a version of history where they were settlers and builders, rather than beneficiaries of theft. Ayesha's claims threatened not just land, but identity itself. "I found evidence of systematic fraud in my father's records. Evidence of violence against peaceful families who trusted agreements signed by territorial representatives. I'm not going to hide that because it makes people uncomfortable." Cole Sutton raised his rifle slightly, and the afternoon suddenly felt charged with the possibility of violence. "Then you're a fool, and you're going to end up with nothing but righteous pride and an empty belly. Maybe." Silas shifted his weight, preparing for whatever came next. "But at least I'll be able to look at myself without shame, which is more than my father managed." The moment stretched tight as wire, Cole Sutton's rifle halfway raised. Silas's hand near his own weapon, 4 horses stamping nervously in the tense silence. Then a figure appeared from behind the barn, moving with deliberate calm into the yard. Ayesha walked directly between the mounted men and Silas's porch, her height and presence causing the horses to sidestep nervously. She carried no weapons, her hands empty and visible, but something in her bearing made the threat of violence suddenly feel small and petty. "You're the one making trouble." Porter pointed at her with unconcealed hostility, filling his head with lies about dead agreements and ancient claims. "I'm telling the truth that his father documented himself." Ayesha's voice carried across the yard without strain. "Truth you're afraid will expose how many of your own deeds were acquired through similar methods." Martin Webb's face went pale, confirming what Ayesha had implied. The silence that followed told Silas everything he needed to know. His father hadn't been alone in his actions. The theft had been systematic, coordinated, a pattern of behavior that built the prosperity these men now defended so viciously. "Silas, you've got one chance to fix this." Webb's voice shook slightly. "Send her away. Burn whatever documents she brought. We'll forget this conversation happened. Your father's reputation stays intact, and so does yours." Silas looked at the men, then at Ayesha standing tall and unafraid in front of armed hostility. He thought about his father's journal, about Ruth Neshoba's disappointed face described in those pages, about Ayesha riding alone across dangerous territory to bring truth to the one person who might listen. "Get off my property." His voice came out steady, final. "All of you, now." Cole Sutton's grip tightened on his rifle. "You're making a mistake." The mistake was already made, by my father, and apparently by yours too. Silas picked up his own rifle, not pointing it, but holding it ready. "The only choice I have now is whether to repeat that mistake or try to make it right. I'm choosing right, even if it costs me everything." The 4 men exchanged